apparently we can start. So initially it was planned that there will be some panel discussion and we will be discussing, but there were so many questions so far and I had to stop the discussions, and you didn't have an opportunity to ask Professor Hoffman questions, so I think we can just take questions and please tell us to whom the question is addressed. It would be best if you could ask questions in English, but of course we also accept questions in Polish, and Professor Hoffman will have a translation. So.
Who will be brave and ask the first question?
Professor Stibiński here.
I have a question to Professor Hoffman, so thank you for excellent talk. I would like to ask about the safety of taking nuclear reactor to the space, because landing and also taking up is not so safe. So what do you think, what is the perspective?
Yeah, the safety of nuclear power in space. We really need a lot of power, and trying to generate solar power on Mars is problematic. Obviously, we have you can have solar cells like we did on the Spirit and Opportunity rovers, but remember, Mars has day and night. A Mars day, or sol we call it, is just a little bit longer than an Earth day. And so you have 12 hours of darkness. When you don't generate solar power, you need lots of batteries or regenerative fuel cells. And the solar cells get covered with dust. So even the two latest rovers, the Curiosity and Perseverance rovers, have nuclear power. Not a nuclear reactor, they have plutonium radioisotope thermoelectric generators. But they only generate a few hundred watts of power. For lots of power, we will need nuclear reactors. Maybe someday we'll have fusion, I hope. But there are many people now working on developing space-qualified nuclear reactors. And as you say, it's not an easy thing to do. Just turning on a nuclear reactor. Normally, when you turn on a nuclear reactor here on Earth, you have lots of people in a control room monitoring everything. It's a very delicate process. We have to develop the capability of doing that all autonomously. So I don't want to say it's going to be easy, but it is necessary. Without the nuclear power, I don't think we will have human exploration of Mars.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yes, please.
I have a question to Professor Hoffman. I want to ask you about your feelings. How you felt when you realized you will be the part of one of the bravest actions in human history, that you can be one of the men that fixed the best telescope at the time, and how you felt just after this moment?
I should tell you all, I started, right now I am working in the aerospace engineering department at MIT, but my education was in astrophysics. My doctorate from Harvard University was in high energy astrophysics, so I'm an astronomer at heart. There are two times in the history of my astronaut career when I had incredible excitement. The first, as you can imagine, was when 8,000 people applied to be an astronaut when I applied. So when I got the call from NASA to ask me, Jeff, are you still interested in becoming an astronaut? You know what the answer was, but that was incredibly exciting. The next, and even more exciting though, people who did not live through the problem of Hubble in the 1990s, you don't appreciate what a disaster it was for NASA, for the astronomy community. I mean, it was catastrophic. And we knew how important it was for NASA and for astronomy to fix the Hubble Space Telescope. And so as you can imagine, I mean, everyone in the astronaut office would have liked to have been on that mission, and I was fortunate enough to be selected. And so when I got the call from the head of the astronaut office telling me that I was going to be on the Hubble mission, I think I was even more excited than when I was first selected as an astronaut. So it was and of course it all worked. I mean, this was, you have to remember, you know, we made it look easy, but this was the most complex mission that we had ever carried out with the space shuttle. And we really demonstrated how astronauts working in spacesuits can do really, really delicate work. I mean, we did some things which were not even anticipated because we had some problems when we were working. And of course, we went on 4 more times to service Hubble and showed the value of it. So yeah, that was an incredibly exciting time, and I've been very fortunate to have been, both as an astronomer and an astronaut, to have been able to put my 2 hands on the Hubble Space Telescope.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, I see questions over there, up there.
So I have a question about, so main challenge about going to Mars with humans is going back from the Mars. So if the main challenge when operating the rovers on Mars is the delay, wouldn't it be much easier to just send the humans to orbit of Mars? That would take, I assume, much less fuel than starting it from the surface. And would it be just easier to send people to orbit? That would eliminate the most challenge with the delay when operating the rovers. And why don't we do it?
You are absolutely correct. It would be much easier just to go and orbit around Mars. But what would I do? I mean, if I'm going to spend 7 months traveling from the Earth to Mars, and we have to solve the problem of radiation and all the other risks that are involved, what am I going to do just going around in orbit around Mars? No, if I'm going to take the trouble and the risk to go all the way to Mars, I want to go where I can actually do something useful. I mean, from orbit, sure, you can operate remote sensing equipment, but we can do that robotically. I want to go to the surface of Mars where I can work with my robotic partners and actually do something that is really valuable that only humans can do. So yeah, I mean, I know people have talked about going an orbit around Mars, but not for me. If I'm going to take the risk and the time to go to Mars, I want to land on the surface and explore the red planet.
So I would also like to make a remark that maybe you two could also ask questions or join.
I have a question, actually. As an astronomer and the person who saved the Hubble, have you ever been tempted at heart to take advantage of your amazing job in space and use Hubble for your own research? I know it's not high energy astrophysics, but still.
After I fixed Hubble, actually, I was asked the same question by several of my older astronomy colleagues. You know, wouldn't you like to work? But I was assigned to another space flight, and of course, that was my first priority, and other things have happened. So I had to leave the utilization of the Hubble telescope to my colleagues.
But would you say that your background in astrophysics could have been a factor of you being selected to this particular mission?
Well, as it turns out, as I mentioned, we've had 5 missions to the Hubble Space Telescope. On every one of those missions, there has been a PhD astronomer. I don't think that was purely random. I didn't have to work as an astronomer, but I think, well, in fact, I was told when I went, after our Hubble mission, I gave a talk at the American Astronomical Society, and several people told me that they felt much more comfortable about the mission knowing that there was a professional astronomer on the mission who appreciated how delicate Hubble was. And I have to say, all of my crew, we treated Hubble very carefully. The last thing that anybody wanted to do was to break something on Hubble that wasn't already broken. But nevertheless, it made my astronomer colleagues much more comfortable to know that there was a professional astronomer on board.
So, I have a question. Yes. I don't know if my microphone is working. Maybe I will use this one. So, because it seems that we live in extraordinary times now. My question is, what do you think about SpaceX and Elon Musk and his mission? I mean, it seems that they make progress, but they take like extra risk. So, what is your opinion?
Well, regarding risk, if you don't take risks, there's no exploration. I mean, all exploration involves a certain risk. It's not just SpaceX. I mean, all of space technology is being transformed because there are so many private companies now which are developing space technology. And the amount of innovation that we've seen coming out of the private sector has been really exciting. I mean, learning how to land rockets vertically. Yes, there's no question SpaceX is taking a risk, although they try to retire that risk before they launch human beings. But the risk of landing, I mean, hopefully you've seen pictures of some of the attempts that were not so successful to land. I mean, it took a lot of failures before they finally had success. And in the private sector, if you have sufficient resources, you can afford to take those risks. If NASA loses a rocket, immediately they have to go to Congress and explain what went wrong and so on. So I'm very enthusiastic about private space flight. And NASA has also recognized the value. I mean, NASA is now using the facilities of SpaceX to launch astronauts to the space station. So this combination of public and private investment in space, I think, has been incredibly valuable, and it's led to the development of a lot of new technology. But without risk, we're never going to explore. We try to reduce the risk as much as possible, understand the risk, but ultimately, I mean, when you're sitting on top of a rocket with, many tons of high explosives underneath you, you need a certain tolerance for risk, or else you maybe are not in the right profession.
Okay, so maybe questions from the audience. Oh, please.
Actually, I have a question for the time being to Dr. Drahus. I'm sorry. Then you said that you were first to observe this Oumuamua object?
Not the first, but we took the best picture ever.
But do you know where this name came from and what does it really mean?
Yeah. So Oumuamua is it's a funny object, right? So this funny name comes from the native Hawaiian language, and it means the very first scout. In fact, O means the first, and mua, like the very, very. So it's the very first scout, the very first visitor from the outer space ever to arrive or to be identified in the solar system. And why they chose the Hawaiian name, that's also very interesting. Well, the basic answer is because it was discovered by a telescope located in Hawaii, by the Pan-STARRS telescope. But there is also a second explanation, namely there is a very big struggle to build a new generation 30-meter telescope on top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, And that's because native Hawaiians realized that this is their sacred mountain, and they don't want this big telescope there. So I think astronomers made kind of, a big smile to the Hawaiian community to name this famous object with the native Hawaiian name, hoping that maybe they will accept this new telescope on top of their sacred mountain.
Did it work?
Well, this is still a matter of debate. There is a lot of friction there, but I keep my fingers crossed for the TMT. It's going to be a really spectacular telescope if it's ever built.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I have also a question to Professor Szybka. You were operating with seconds, hundreds of seconds, whatever it means. Was the time flying in the same way as it is flying right now?
So when you compare the early universe, for example, you look at some regular processes, and then there is a time shift in that. So for example, when you calculate the distance, and the distance depends, the measure of the distance depends on the amount of energy that is arriving now, this has to be taken into account.
Okay, other questions? I see one over there. Yes.
So I have a question to Professor Hoffman. So if I understand you correctly, Mars had oxygen, so it also had to have oxygen. Oh, Mars had water, so it also had to have oxygen. Now on Mars, there is about 0.68% of the oxygen. So what happened to it? And is life on Mars still possible?
Is life on Mars still, what happens? Well, I'm not sure I understood the first part of your question, but is life still possible on Mars? Life as we know it on the surface of the Earth that depends on oxygen, we don't think is possible on Mars. But let's remember, there are bacteria here on Earth that have learned how to survive deep underground, and they don't use oxygen. They use other chemical elements to generate energy. What we have found here on Earth is that any place here on Earth where there is water, there is life. We think that, as I said, maybe if there was single-cell life that evolved on Mars, maybe as the atmosphere evaporated, if that life went underground, it could still, if it learned how to live without oxygen. And remember, the first life on Earth did not use oxygen. The first atmosphere that the Earth had was mostly carbon dioxide, just like on Mars, coming out of the volcanoes. And so that life did not need oxygen. If those bacteria or single-cell organisms went underground, they might still be living happily on Mars. We just don't know. But that's why I said, ultimately, we're going to have to start drilling, and drilling deep, to look and see if there's anything underground. Because almost certainly there's no life on the surface of Mars. It's a very harsh environment. Someday, we hope there will be life on Mars, human life, and any other life that we bring with it. Until then, maybe underground, we still don't know.
Okay, thank you. And yes, the next question. Yes, please.
Yeah, so my question is directed to Professor Hoffman, and it is that, how did your body feel when coming back from outer space in comparison to when you first took off from Earth?
Very, very heavy. That's the first thing. I mean, life without gravity, it's a new world. It's an experience which, people often ask me, what does it feel like to be in space? That's a very hard question to answer in words, because language depends on shared experience. You know, if I say that chair is red, even if you don't see the chair, you know what I'm talking about because you have seen red. But you've never experienced being weightless. As an example, suppose you met somebody, a Bedouin from the desert, Sahara Desert, who's never seen water except maybe in a glass. Could you describe to them what it feels like to go swimming underwater? Very, very difficult. You know, what does it feel like to get your whole body wet? If you do, and so what I can tell you is that it is a feeling of physical freedom which everybody who experiences it, when they come back, they will tell you that it changes your life. It changes your feeling about gravity. It changes your feeling about, you know, your physical body. And what I felt, particularly on my 5th and final space flight, and I kind of knew that that was going to be my last space flight, it was a feeling of sadness that, you know, I had been privileged to spend 50 days during my 5 space flights in this weightless world, and now I'm the prisoner of gravity, like all of us, once again. But I was very fortunate to have, for a short time, been able to experience this new world, and I'm convinced that, you know, the more people who go up there, now that private spaceflight is becoming more common, you know, if you can afford to do it, and right now that's pretty expensive, I know, but it's an experience which is new to most human beings, and it's something that once you experience it, you'll never forget.
Would you say that this can become addictive, or?
Well, I was able to break the habit, not by my own choice. People have actually talked, sort of joking though, among the astronauts. Yeah, we talk about spaceflight as being like an addictive drug. Once you've done it, you want to do it again and again and again. If somebody offered me a chance to go up, I'd do it in a second. Although I tell them, don't tell my wife, because she would not be happy.
Great. Okay, more questions. I see one over there. Yes. No, over there is a gentleman. Yes.
Actually, I have a question for Dr. Drahus. Is it possible to use Hyades for exploration of other celestial bodies, like, I don't know, ice moons of Jupiter?
Absolutely. It's going to be a very universal telescope, I mean, designed for a specific type of observations, but we will be free to direct it to any target we want to, anytime. So it's one of the advantages to have an own mission. You can do with this telescope whatever you want. And so yes, the short answer is definitely yes.
Okay, and how can we get the data from the data of the ratio of the heavy water and normal water on these other celestial bodies?
So when it comes to the moons that you mentioned, we don't have a specific scientific program for this kind of observations at this stage. But what I meant is that if we come up with a meaningful idea for good observations to be made, then we can do it. But we don't have any research plans for that right now.
I should mention, however, when we talk about the icy moons of Jupiter, NASA is getting ready to launch what is called the Europa Clipper. You know, Europa, we have discovered the surface of Europa is covered with ice, but underneath that ice, and we don't really know how thick the ice is, but underneath there is a liquid ocean. As I said before, every place on Earth where we find liquid water, we've found life. And so there is a lot of speculation could there be life on the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn? Liquid water, we'll find out. Someday we'll learn how to drill through that ice and maybe be able to answer that question.
Yes, so this Europa Clipper will be a much better instrument to study the icy moons compared to Hyades. Yeah.
And is it possible that the eventual life on these icy moons comes from the, I don't know, other celestial bodies?
That we just don't know. I mean, one of the most fascinating reasons for looking for other life in the solar system or anywhere else, you know, biology, everything we know about biology is based on one form of life. Despite all of the variety of life on Earth, it's all based on DNA information processing. Is that the only way to have, I mean, it's hard to recognize what life might be in other forms, but, you know, maybe there are other systems of having closed systems where entropy is decreased rather than increased and information is processed, which is at the basis of what we consider to be life. So it's fascinating. I mean, right now, trying to understand principles of universal biology would be like trying to understand principles of universal linguistics if you only speak one language. So it's something that, you know, we will continue to search for other forms of life because that will teach us more about what life really is.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe here.
Hello, I've got a question to the professor. I would like you to hear what is the feeling when you're in space, in the vacuum, in the void. What's the how to describe a feeling when you know that the only thing that separates you from the void, from the vacuum, is your suit?
I love my spacesuit, and I trust my spacesuit. Before every space flight, I took my spacesuit into a vacuum chamber, and I lived for several hours inside my spacesuit, and that really gives you a confidence that the spacesuit is going to work. On the other hand, there is always a certain risk, not just wearing a spacesuit, I mean just sitting on top of a rocket and launching into space. And people often ask me, how do I deal with that risk? And I'll just take advantage of a minute to share at least what it means to me. You're sitting on top of a rocket ready to launch. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. And that there are many things that if they go wrong, if the crew, if the people do the right things, you know, we have redundant systems and we can fix things and so we can solve problems. And I was fully confident, and the same is true about a spacesuit. Many things can go wrong, and I spend a lot of time training, you know, if this happens, this is what I do, and so on. And so I was fully confident that if something went wrong that we could do something about, we were well trained, and we would know, and we would do the right thing. Obviously, there's many things in spaceflight that can go wrong, and you can't do anything about. So why worry about it? That's the way, at least my personality, and I think that's, you know, if sitting on top of a loaded rocket makes you feel, you know, emotionally insecure, maybe you're not in the right business. Hard to say.
Yeah. But at the same time, Challenger, Columbia, these were your friends.
Absolutely, we understand there's a risk, but again, if there's nothing that I can do about it, I don't spend a lot of time worrying. But again, that's my personality. If you worry too much about what's going to go wrong, you probably shouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, maybe here. Yes.
So I have a question for Dr. Hoffman. Is Earth going to lose its magnetic field like Mars did?
We were in low Earth orbit, basically inside the Earth's protective magnetic field. The only human beings who have really gone beyond the Earth's magnetic field were the Apollo astronauts, and they, of course, were exposed to much more radiation than we were, because the magnetic field protects us. It deflects the charged particles. We have to learn to deal with the radiation of space if we're going to explore deep space, and it's still one of the, I have to say honestly, it's a problem which is still not really solved. There are many people working on both passive shielding, possibly active shielding, possibly biological ways of protecting ourselves against, or pharmacological ways of protecting ourselves against radiation. But once you go outside the Earth's magnetic field, you are exposed to the full force of cosmic radiation, which is a lot more dangerous than we experience in low Earth orbit, either on the shuttle or on the International Space Station. You could live on the International Space Station for several years and not exceed your lifetime radiation dose, but a trip to Mars and back, and that's probably the only space flight you're ever going to make, because you'll have a lifetime radiation dose, unless we figure out ways for better radiation protection and tolerance. So it's an unsolved problem, and any of you aspiring students who has ideas of protecting human beings from radiation, NASA would love to hear about it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe over there is, yes, the young lady who wants to ask a question for quite a time.
Mam pytanie.
Yes, it can be.
Pytanie jest takie, czy można by było wysłać sztuczną inteligencję na Marsa, żeby z zadaniem określonym, no, to co chcemy, żeby zrobili na przykład ludzie zamiast ludzi, albo can we send AI on Mars to explore it?
AI, I mean, we certainly are sending computers to Mars on our rovers, and I suspect that, I mean, the Perseverance rover compared to the Curiosity rover has more intelligence. It can drive farther by itself. It's a long way from artificial intelligence. But you're absolutely right. The next generation of rovers is being designed. I don't think they will be like having an astronaut on the surface of Mars, but they will certainly have a lot more capability to plan their own trajectories, to recognize danger, and possibly even to repair themselves. One of my students is working on a research project of rovers which have enough intelligence to diagnose problems, and if they're properly designed, actually to reconfigure themselves to solve those problems. So there's no question the advances in artificial intelligence are going to make their way into space technology. But I should say, space computers are always at least one generation behind computers on Earth, because the radiation environment in space would basically destroy the typical computer that we have here on Earth. So once you develop a new generation of processors, then it takes another generation to make those processors radiation tolerant, and that's why the computers that we send into space are much less powerful than the computers that we have available here on Earth.
Okay, here. Yep.
Professor Hoffman, in one of the recent interviews, you were asked, what would you advise to our Polish astronaut, Sławomir Szuznański? And you mentioned, one of the things you mentioned was to take the opportunity to enjoy the experience and appreciate where you are. So I wanted to ask if you had the chance to do something fun with your crew, or when you went out to fix the Hubble telescope, which requires a lot of focus, I assume, did you have the time to take the moment, appreciate, and really enjoy it, what you're doing and where you are?
Yeah, luckily, you know, every time that we would take out an old instrument and put in a new instrument, we would then have to wait for a little bit, and mission control would actually analyze that all the electrical connections were made properly. I will share with you the experience like that I remember the most. We were up way at the top of the Hubble telescope. They have magnetometers to sense the Earth's magnetic field because the telescope uses the magnetic field to orient itself some of the time. Both of the magnetometers had broken, and so we had to put on new magnetometers. And after we did that, we had to stay up there. You know, normally if we had been down inside the cargo bay, we could have gone off and done some other useful work. But it takes time to go from the top to the bottom. It's about 15 meters. And so they just said, you know, stay up there and wait 5-10 minutes while we check things out. And I just turned around so that I couldn't see the shuttle, and there was the whole sky and just me floating. And it was the most intense experience that I ever had, of just being in space, not as part of the shuttle, but just me and space and the stars and the Earth down below. So yes, I never lost the opportunity to actually enjoy myself while I was up there. Of course, NASA doesn't send us up so that we can have a good time. They send us up to do useful work, and I did plenty of useful work, but I had a great time while I was doing it.
Great. Thank you.
I think over there. Yes, yes.
So I have a question towards Professor Szybka. Like when we have like the image of cosmic microwave background, I am curious, like if there are like differences in temperatures that we can see, are there maybe connected with the differences of density of matter in the early universe, and could like the areas corresponding with bigger density of matter be a good place to search for the source of supermassive black holes?
I mean, so yes, you are right. So what we see in CMB is variation of the density of this at the early stage of the universe. And all these overdensities are seeds of the structure, all the structures that exist now. But how go from this to the structures we see nowadays is a hard problem, and it's not totally solved. I mean, as you know, probably huge amount of the things that exist in the universe has a form of dark matter, and to understand this thing it's necessary to understand this thing to know how the structures grow in the universe. And we don't know exactly what dark matter is, so there is like a little bit of freedom in this process when you describe structure formation. But of course, people are working on that. And
yeah, that question, how did structure evolve out of chaos, is still one of the leading questions of cosmology. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm sorry, if I could just bump in and maybe ask a question. I'm the one carrying the microphone here. Great. Because I would like to ask a follow-up question to the one kind of asked by my friend here. I would ask Professor Hoffman how did he handle and how did he feel the pressure working in such an unknown environment on such an expensive equipment with such little room for error and such little room as such little knowledge on how to actually work in such an environment. Was your heart racing? How did the pressure feel?
Well, when NASA selects astronauts, they look into our background to try to determine, do we have the kind of personality that can deal with that kind of a risk? I mean, I have I've jumped out of airplanes with a parachute. I've, you know, scuba diving, mountain climbing. People have done many things, but yeah, I mean, you have to be able to deal reasonably with risk. You have to, and that means you try to understand the risk. You deal as much as possible to reduce the risk, but then you have to be able to accept the risk and live with it. I have to tell you, quite frankly, it is much easier for an astronaut to deal with the risk than for the hardest thing is on the astronaut's family. I'll share you know, in terms of risk and being afraid, because, you know, my wife did not like launches, okay? I mean, she didn't like the risk, particularly my second space flight was scheduled. It would have been the very next flight after the Challenger disaster. So you can imagine what that, you know, does to your family who sees people, you know, die on television. But it's a risk that I'm willing to accept because I get all the benefit of then being able to go into space. I'll just share with you a story. There were two astronauts. One of them was a Navy fighter pilot, and the other was a female biologist. They both were in my class of astronauts. They fell in love, they got married. Well, the first person to fly was the Navy fighter pilot. Then, when it was my turn to fly with this woman, and so my wife and the fighter pilot were together watching the launch, and the pilot turned to my wife and said, you know, when I was sitting on top of the rocket, didn't bother me at all. I mean, I'm used to that. But I see my wife up there. I'm terrified. So, you know, risk and how you deal with that really depends on your personality and also on the circumstances. But it is part of space flight. It's part of all, as I said, it's part of exploration. I mean, when people set out in ships to cross the ocean back hundreds of years ago, you know, when Magellan started around the world, you know, only a few people made it back to safety, and Magellan himself didn't make it. So exploration has its risks, and if you're not willing to take those risks, you don't explore.
Thank you. Sorry for bumping in.
Okay. So returning to the previous question, I have to advertise that Professor Szybka is actually an expert of chaotic behavior in cosmology, and maybe we will be able to persuade him to give another talk next time. But there was a question over there, and I somehow, yes, skip you for so many times, for such a long time. So, yes.
So, like, apart from the Mars explorations, are there any other plans to get to know other planets and send rovers?
With rovers, really, aside from the moon, there's no, I mean, we will have rovers on the moon, but when you look at the other planets, I mean, Venus, I mean, the surface of Venus is so hot that metal melts, you know, lead, it would melt. I mean, the Russians many years ago did manage to land a probe on the surface of Venus. It only survived for a very short time, so I don't think rovers on Venus are going to be with us. Venus has a solid surface. Mercury might be possible, you know, if you stayed in the shadow regions of Mercury. But going farther out in the solar system, you know, Jupiter, Saturn, these are the gas giants. There is no real surface for a rover to move around on. That leaves us with the asteroids. And of course, the thing is about the asteroids, the gravity is so little, you can't really have a rover driving around. But we have landed probes on the surface of of asteroids. And but solid surfaces on the outer part of the solar system, maybe Pluto someday. Pluto does seem to have a solid surface, but it's pretty far away. And so far we've just had the one flyby mission of Pluto. Looks like a fascinating planet with its own satellite. Maybe someday we'll have a rover out there. Maybe you'll see it in your lifetime. I hope so.
Thank you. Okay, here.
My question to Professor Hoffman concerns starry sky. What are general differences between stars, between firmament watched from the Earth and from space?
Well, as an astronomer, I love to look up at the stars. There are two big differences looking at the stars from space and from the Earth. The first is, sometimes I like to ask my students a question, but I'll give you the answer. When you look at them from space, stars do not twinkle. You know, here on Earth, twinkle, twinkle, little star, because the atmosphere is always moving around. But up in space, there is no atmosphere, and so the stars do not twinkle. The second thing, when you're going around the Earth, the first part of the night, you're in the northern hemisphere, and I can look up and see Ursa Major and Cygnus, the Northern Cross. 10 minutes later, I see the Southern Cross and Alpha Centauri, so you see the entire sky in 1/2 hour of a nighttime orbit, which of course here on Earth, you can never do that.
And what about Milky Way?
Meteors.
Milky Way.
Oh, the Milky Way doesn't look that different. No, I mean the sky. You can see about the same magnitude of stars down to about 6th magnitude from space as you can, not here in the city, but you know, if you're out on a mountaintop or on a clear night on a desert somewhere, it's the limit of human vision. So the Milky Way really doesn't look any different.
And the sky is really black?
Space, and I've heard many astronauts will tell you this, space is the blackest black that you can imagine. It is truly black.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, there is a question in the very, very corner of the room up there. Yes,
with the white hat?
So I have a question for Professor Hoffman. So as we know, there are 2 people right now stuck in the space, and I would like to ask you about your feelings about this situation, and maybe you are jealous of them that they have so much time there without work.
Well, look, there's always things that you have not done. You know, people ask me, wouldn't I have liked to have gone to the moon? Sure, I would love to have gone to the moon, but how can I complain? I mean, I've had incredible experiences. I'm thankful for that. to be jealous that other people are doing things that I can't do, that would not be right. I mean, I'm thankful for what I was able to do, and I've had experiences which I'll never forget. And if I could do something else, that would be great, but I have no complaints.
Would you worry about those astronauts being stuck? Would you worry about those astronauts being stuck there right now?
You're talking about Butch and Suni up there. No, I mean, obviously, there were some personal problems back on. I'm more concerned with their families back on Earth. They're having a great time up there, okay? I mean, you know, they were going to go for 8 days. They're going to have 8 months. I mean, that's like getting an extra bonus. But, you know, I was mentioning to my wife, I mean, my first space flight was supposed to be 4 days. We ended up staying a week. And she said that was bad enough. If we had ended up having to spend 7 months up there, she would have gone crazy. So it's much more of a difficulty for all the arrangements you make, you know, back on Earth, and now all of a sudden you're up in space. So I don't worry about the astronauts, but I'm sympathetic with their families back on Earth who have to deal with them not being there.
Yes, maybe down there, yes. Yes.
I would like to ask Professor Hoffman a question regarding potential prospects of development of spaceflight and his own moral approach towards prospect of its development and its ethical issues.
Could you restate the question? I didn't quite understand what you're asking.
Well, I would like to ask you, what do you think about prospects of development of commercial spaceflight and your own moral approach about it?
Well, as I said, I'm enthusiastic about private spaceflight because it has produced a tremendous amount of innovation. The other thing about when you talk about profits, you know, every year NASA has to go to Congress and ask for money for their budget so that they can do all of the activities which we would like to do in space, and they never have enough money. And any year, Congress could turn around and say, you know, that's enough, no more. On the other hand, once you start making a profit in some activity, it becomes self-sustaining, and you don't have to worry about going back to Congress every year. So I'm enthusiastic, yes, we have to explore space ethically and sustainably, and that's a challenge as more and more rockets are launched. That's a challenge we're going to have to face. But I'm very enthusiastic about the profit motive because that will keep things going on their own sustainably in a way that has not been possible when everything depends on funding from the government.
And do you think that it is possible for us as species to turn spaceflight into something like taking a train right now in future?
It's going to be a while, but you know, think about all of the other advances in technology. My parents told me that back in the 1930s, when airplanes first started taking passengers across the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and the United States, it was incredibly expensive. Back in those days, maybe $10,000, and in the 1930s, that was a lot of money. More and more airplanes, advances in technology, and now, you know, millions of people fly airplanes all over. I don't know how long it's going to be before that kind of access to space becomes available at a much more economical rate, but I hope that someday we won't think any more of taking a trip to the moon than we do of getting on an airplane and flying to Japan. You know, 50 years ago, that would have been unimaginable. So we'll have to wait and see. Those of you who end up going into advanced science and engineering, you know, you're the generation who will develop the technology to make that possible. So good luck to you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay. Yeah.
What kind of selection did you have to went through to become an astronaut? And did you wanted to give up during it?
What was the last?
Did you want to give up during it? Did you have the moment that you thought that maybe astronaut isn't my thing and it might not be possible?
The selection is very, very rigorous. I mean, when I applied to be an astronaut, everything was on paper. It was a long application, but still, we had 8,000 people apply, and they selected 35 of us. In the most recent selection by NASA, and I think the same thing is typical in Europe now with the European Space Agency, we had 18,000 applicants, and they only took 10. So it's highly selective. They look at everything that you've ever done in your life, and they look at excellence in everything that you've done. I've been on panels which select astronauts, and I have to tell you, there's many, many people who are qualified to be an astronaut, and we just can't take that many people. The second part of your question, did I ever get to the point where I wanted to stop? I was in a kind of a unique situation. I mentioned that my 5th space flight I thought would probably be the last one. And the reason was they actually offered me to have another space flight. But NASA, ever since the 1960s, has had a diplomatic representative for Europe because we have so much scientific cooperation between NASA and European scientists. And so there's been a NASA diplomatic representative based in Paris at the US Embassy. And I was offered that job to go and live in Paris at government expense, by the way, and work as NASA's representative for 4 years. So they said, all right, Jeff, you have to choose. You can have another flight to space, or you can go to Paris. If you can believe, I got a little help from my wife in making that decision, and we chose Paris, and we had a wonderful 4 years. Would I have loved to have gone into space again? Sure. But they said, you know, you can go to space or you can go to Paris, but you can't do both. So we chose Paris.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we're running out of time, so I think we can manage to have one more question, maybe over there, and that would be the last one.
Now I feel the pressure of asking the last question. I wanted to ask Professor Hoffman 2 things. The first one being, what was going through your head when you were being launched into space for the very first time? How did you feel about that? And my second question is, do you really need that much duct tape in space? Because in every movie, Apollo 13, Space Cowboys, The Martian, they just use so much duct tape.
Let me answer the second question first. Space flight would be absolutely impossible without duct tape and Velcro, okay? Yeah, we use duct tape for everything. What went through my mind? I'll tell you, particularly on the space shuttle, the first 2 minutes, we have those solid rocket boosters. There's tremendous vibration. Everything is shaking. People told me before my first flight, they said, imagine all the noise and vibration that you can possibly imagine. It's going to be a lot worse than that. And sure enough, you know, it was shaking around so much. I was just holding on and saying, I guess this is normal, because I was on the, you know, the shuttle had flown 10 or 12 times before, and it had never fallen apart. But nevertheless, I was holding on. Boy, I hope this thing holds together. although after 2 minutes, then the solid boosters, and again, this is unique to the shuttle, the solid boosters fall off, and then it's very quiet, and you just sort of lean back and you feel the G's come on, and at that point, the wonderful thing is when, after about 8.5 minutes, the engines stop, and all of a sudden you start to feel yourself floating out of your seat. And I floated over to the window, and there was the coast of Africa coming over the horizon. And that's when it really hit me. I mean, I had dreamed about going into space since I was 6 years old. And all of a sudden, I finally realized, oh my God, I am in space, I'm in orbit. I couldn't stop smiling for hours. It was a wonderful experience.
Okay, thank you very much. So,
and thank you to the audience for such good questions. It's been a very interesting evening.
So, so I have an opportunity to thank all the speakers for today's evening. So thank you very much, and also on my side, thank you very much to the audience for showing up in this very rainy day. Now I would like to ask the Dean in a moment also to conclude our meeting, but before I do this, there is just one announcement. Please do not forget to give back the headphones for the translation. And another thing that I would like to do is to thank the person without whom this wouldn't be possible and who organized all that. And she's standing over there. This is you know, this is a tremendous job to organize a meeting for basically 400 people. So thank you very much once again. And now.
All right. So first thing, some of you maybe remember that I had an opportunity and pleasure to open this event and invite you on board the Enterprise. The Enterprise is going to land. But before it will actually land, I'd like to do two things. First thing is that I would like to hand this small token of appreciation to Professor Hoffman. It's a pen, but a pen that it has an inscription of university, but also inscription of Nicolaus Copernicus. Wow. And you don't know, but Professor Hoffman is a great fan of Copernicus, and actually this is one of the reasons that he is in Krakow. So I hope that whenever you will use it, you will have a nice memory, recollection of your time in Krakow, and we hope to see you again sometime in the future. I have to
say Copernicus has been one of my heroes throughout my life, and I had a great thrill yesterday at the main library where very unusually, they took the original manuscript written in hand by Nicholas Copernicus, and I was able not to touch it, of course, but actually to look with my own eyes at the diagram of the planets going around the sun. What a thrill.
Yeah, we are sorry, we were looking for original Copernicus pen that he actually used to write it, but it was not available, so you have to forgive us.
We'll
so
you.
Thank you very
so
much. But the second thing is, it was already partially done. I would like to thank all the speakers, and I also would like to thank all of you for being here and making this meeting, this event so lively. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.